What if the Crusades, one of the most debated series of events in medieval history, are not as simple as they are often presented today? For many viewers, their understanding comes from modern interpretations, films like Kingdom of Heaven, documentaries, and simplified school narratives. In those versions, the Crusades are often framed in a very direct moral structure, where one side is seen as aggressors and the other as victims. But when we slow down and actually examine the historical landscape, we enter a far more complicated world where motivations were layered and where no single explanation fully captures the reality of what happened. This is not about rewriting history into something it is not, but about understanding why so many different interpretations exist in the first place. Because once you begin to look beyond the surface, you realize the Crusades were not a single event with a single meaning, but a series of conflicts shaped by centuries of political tension, religious identity, and survival instincts. And that is where the real story begins to unfold. To understand how the world reached the point of the Crusades, we first have to look at what existed long before them. In the early centuries of Christianity, the religion was not limited to Europe as many people assume today. Large regions of the Middle East and North Africa were deeply Christian, with established communities, theological centers, and long traditions of worship. One of the major turning points in this transformation of the ancient world came during the reign of Constantine the Great, who legalized Christianity within the Roman Empire. This decision allowed the faith to spread rapidly across Roman territories, reshaping cultural and political identities over time. However, history rarely remains stable for long periods. As centuries passed, shifting political structures, internal divisions, and external pressures gradually transformed the religious landscape of entire regions. Areas that were once predominantly Christian would, over time, become part of new political and cultural systems. This long transformation did not happen overnight, and it cannot be reduced to a single cause. Instead, it unfolded across generations, setting the stage for future conflicts that would later define the medieval world. As the centuries progressed, the balance of power across the ancient world began to shift dramatically. In the 7th century, a new political and religious movement emerged from the Arabian Peninsula and expanded across vast territories at an extraordinary speed. This period, known in history as the Islamic conquests, resulted in the rapid transformation of regions that had previously been under Byzantine or Persian control. Empires that had existed for centuries suddenly faced collapse or severe contraction within a relatively short historical window. But to understand this properly, it is important not to view it through a modern lens of simple categorization. These were complex military and political expansions occurring in a world already weakened by long wars, economic strain, and internal instability. Borders changed, administrations shifted, and over time, entire regions adopted new cultural and religious identities. This process created a new geopolitical reality, one where former centers of Christianity in the East were now part of a different civilizational framework. And this transformation would echo for centuries, shaping how later generations understood both conflict and identity. While these transformations were happening in the East, Europe was experiencing its own set of challenges. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the region entered a long period of fragmentation and uncertainty. Trade routes that once connected continents became less secure, and political authority was divided among competing kingdoms and local rulers. Even symbolic events, such as the sack of Rome in 846, reflected the instability of the time. Europe was not a unified or dominant force during this period, but rather a collection of societies struggling to maintain order in a changing world. This environment created a mindset shaped by survival, defense, and regional conflict. Over time, memories of external raids, disrupted trade, and political vulnerability became part of how European societies understood their place in the wider world. These conditions did not directly cause the Crusades, but they contributed to the psychological and political framework in which later decisions were made. Because when stability finally began to return, those earlier experiences had already shaped how threats and opportunities were perceived. By the late 11th century, the Byzantine Empire found itself under increasing pressure in Anatolia. One of the most significant turning points in this decline came at the Battle of Manzikert, where Byzantine forces suffered a devastating defeat. This event did not simply represent a military loss. It marked the beginning of a larger transformation in the region's political and demographic structure. As control weakened, new populations moved into areas that had long been under Byzantine influence, and the empire struggled to maintain stability along its eastern frontier. Faced with these challenges, the Byzantine leadership made an unprecedented decision. They reached out to Western Europe for military assistance, despite long-standing religious and political divisions between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic branches of Christianity. This request was not made lightly. It reflected a deep sense of urgency and recognition that the situation had moved beyond internal control. It is within this context of crisis and appeal that the foundations for the Crusades were laid. In response to these appeals, a major turning point in medieval history occurred in 1095. At the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II delivered a message that would spread rapidly across Europe and ignite an unprecedented movement. His call was framed not only as a military request but as a moral and spiritual appeal, urging Christians to assist fellow believers and to respond to reports of hardship in the East. What made this moment so powerful was not just the speech itself, but the environment in which it was received. Europe at the time was deeply fragmented, with constant local conflicts between nobles and kingdoms. The idea of redirecting that internal conflict outward created a unifying force that few had anticipated. As word spread, people from all levels of society began preparing for a journey that would take them far beyond the world they had ever known. This was not a single organized army, but a wave of movements, driven by belief, ambition, survival, and uncertainty. And as they moved eastward, the scale and complexity of what they were entering became increasingly clear. The First Crusade unfolded not as a single coordinated campaign, but as a series of fragmented movements that gradually converged toward the eastern Mediterranean. What followed was a long and difficult journey marked by logistical challenges, unfamiliar terrain, and intense conflict. Despite these obstacles, the crusading forces eventually reached their objective and, in 1099, captured Jerusalem. However, this moment cannot be understood in simple terms of victory or defeat alone. It was the result of prolonged sieges, shifting alliances, and extreme conditions that affected all sides involved. Following the capture, new political entities were established in the region, often referred to as Crusader states, which existed for many decades but remained under constant pressure. Over time, control of key territories shifted repeatedly, and no single power maintained permanent dominance. Even diplomatic efforts, such as those led by Frederick II, demonstrated that negotiation could sometimes achieve what warfare could not. Yet even these moments of diplomacy were temporary in their effects, as the region continued to change hands across generations. When examining the long history of the Crusades, what becomes clear is that there is no simple narrative that fully captures the complexity of what occurred. Different periods of the Crusades produced different outcomes, some military successes, some failures, and many situations that fall somewhere in between. The region itself remained a contested space for centuries, shaped by shifting alliances, religious motivations, and political realities that evolved over time. Because of this, the Crusades cannot be reduced to a single judgment or interpretation. Instead, they reflect the broader nature of medieval history itself, unpredictable, fragmented, and deeply influenced by the context of the era. Understanding this does not require choosing one side or another, but recognizing that historical events are often more complex than the stories told about them later. And as we move into the conclusion, the focus shifts from what happened to how it is remembered, and why those interpretations continue to matter today. The way the Crusades are remembered today is shaped as much by modern storytelling as by medieval reality. Films like Kingdom of Heaven and various documentaries have played a major role in shaping public perception, often simplifying complex historical events into more accessible narratives. While this helps audiences engage with history, it can also flatten the depth and contradiction that define the original events. The Crusades were not a single moral category, but a long series of actions influenced by fear, belief, politics, and survival. When these elements are reduced, the result is a version of history that feels clear, but may not fully reflect the complexity of what actually happened. This is why historical interpretation continues to evolve, as new research and perspectives challenge older assumptions and encourage a more layered understanding of the past. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Crusades is their internal impact on Europe itself. Before this period, Europe was deeply divided, with constant conflicts between kingdoms and feudal lords. Warfare within Europe was not the exception, it was the norm. But with the emergence of a perceived external threat, there was a gradual shift in how leaders and societies viewed their priorities. Internal conflicts did not disappear entirely, but in some periods, they were reduced or redirected outward. This shift contributed to the formation of a kind of shared identity, even if it was largely based on religion at the time. In addition, ideas such as loyalty, chivalry, and even the concept of holy war became more defined, influencing European culture for centuries to come. At the same time, this transformation came at a cost. It also contributed to justifying violence in certain contexts and reinforced rigid perceptions of the other. In other words, the Crusades were not just a clash between civilizations. They were also a turning point that reshaped Europe from within, both culturally and politically. When we look at the Crusades today, it becomes clear that they are no longer just a historical event. They have become a symbol used in different ways, depending on the context. Sometimes they are presented as an example of religious conflict, while in other cases, they are used to highlight how history can be misunderstood or even manipulated. This continued use shows that historical events do not simply end when their time passes, they continue to influence modern discussions and perspectives. The challenge is that each side often selects specific parts of the story to emphasize while ignoring the broader picture. This makes true understanding more difficult, because the reality is usually spread across multiple narratives, not contained within a single one. That is why, when trying to understand the Crusades today, we should not only ask, what happened, but also, how and why is this story being told in this way? Because the way history is told can be just as important as the events themselves. In the end, this reminds us that understanding the past is not just about learning facts. It is an ongoing effort to understand people, their decisions, and the circumstances that shaped them. Ultimately, the Crusades remain one of the most debated and misunderstood chapters in medieval history. They were shaped by a world very different from our own, where political power, religious identity, and survival were deeply intertwined. Rather than fitting neatly into modern categories of right and wrong, they reflect the complexity of human societies under pressure. The real lesson is not about assigning simple labels to historical actors, but about understanding how narratives are formed over time. Because history is not only about what happened, it is also about how it is remembered, retold, and reinterpreted across generations. And when we revisit events like the Crusades with that in mind, we begin to see not just a story of conflict, but a reflection of how human beings have always struggled to define meaning in moments of great change.